Welcome to Drive the Daf, clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
We will begin with after Shabbos Daf Kuf Yud Gimel with the Mishnah near the top of the Daf. The Mishnah is discussing the halachos of tying and untying ropes, and when a certain knot is considered permanent and when it's not permanent. Of machlokas on the subject. And this will take us into a related discussion of muktzah, about the parts of a weaving loom. Then we get to another Mishnah which talks about folding clothing, when it's considered preparation or tikkun, and a related discussion about the various different halachas which are learned out of the pasuk in Yeshaya about covered for Shabbos, wearing nice clothing, speaking properly, walking properly, and not checking out your personal interests. This will take us into a side discussion about Rus and Shmuel, and about the soldiers of Sancheriv's army. So let's begin with the Mishnah, discussing different types of ropes which may or may not be tied, and we're discussing the rope that holds the bucket to the well. The issue is, if you tie the rope onto the bucket, that is something that stays there for a long time. It stays there forever. It remains fixed there. So the Mishnah says that everybody agrees that if you use something which is clothing, like a belt that you intend to wear, that's definitely not going to stay there for a long time. Therefore, you're allowed to use that to tie to the rope to lower to the bottom of the well. Whether you're allowed to use a standard rope or not is machlokes. The Rabbanan say that it is forbidden, and Rabbi Yehuda says that it is permitted. And then Rabbi Yehuda adds a rule, and he says anything which is not going to last long term, that's not an Isser D'Oraisa. And the Gemara is going to have to try to figure out how these two psukim of Rabbi Yehuda fit together. And so we will figure this out by introducing the rope that weavers use. Then we'll have another halacha about the rope that weavers use, and we'll launch into an entire discussion about various different parts of the weaving loom. So first of all, the Gemara says, how could Rabbi Yehuda say that it is permitted to tie the rope there? What is he referring to? If it's referring to a regular standard rope, so then it's going to stay there forever. How could Rabbi Yehuda say that it's permitted? He himself said anything which is short term is permitted, but long term is forbidden. So the Gemara says he's not talking about a standard rope, he's talking about a special rope that is part of the weaving system. It's the rope that lowers and raises the frame that has the vertical threads set into it. So the Gemara says, now hold on a second, so what's the machlekes? How come the Rabbanan say that it's forbidden, Rabbi Yehuda say it's permitted? Obviously the Rabbanan hold that even though that rope's not going to stay there, we're afraid you're going to confuse that rope with standard ropes. And Rabbi Yehuda says you're not going to confuse the ropes. So then we have a contradiction, because we have a different Mishnah about a different subject where the Rabbanan aren't afraid for confusion, and Rabbi Yehuda is. What's that case? It's about the rope of the bucket that broke. So how can you fix that? So the Chachamim say you're allowed to make a slip knot, a bow. Rabbi Yehuda says no, you're not allowed to make any kind of knot at all. You have to take a piece of clothing, a belt or an undergarment, and hold the two broken ends together and wrap it around with this thing, but don't make any knots. So obviously what's going on over here, Rabbi Yehuda holds that you can't make a slip knot because it'll get confused with a regular knot. And the Chachamim say, no, you're not afraid that it'll get confused. So that is contradictory to what we say in our Mishnah, according to the way we're understanding it now, that the Rabbanan hold you will confuse a weaving rope with a regular rope, and Rabbi Yehuda is not afraid of that. So the Gemara says it's not a kasha. Not a kasha either way. Rabbi Yehuda is not a steer to himself, and the Rabbanan are not a steer to themselves. The Rabbanan say that you cannot use a weaver's rope because you'll get confused and you'll end up using a regular rope. As far as slip knots don't get confused. Ropes get confused. Knots, different kinds of knots do not get confused with each other. Now, what does Rabbi Yehuda hold? Rabbi Yehuda holds we're never concerned about confusion. You don't mix up anything with anything else. The problem with a slip knot is Rabbi Yehuda holds that a slip knot is also, if it's a permanent long-term slip knot, it's forbidden to make, even though it's a slip knot that doesn't help you at all. Okay, now the Gemara has another halacha concerning the ropes of the weaving, and this is a statement of Rav Abba named Rav Chia Barashi named of Rav. A person is allowed to take a rope and tie it in front of his cow. He's allowed to bring the rope from his house and tie it in front of his cow. Now he ties one, not in front of his cow, but to his cow. He ties one end to the cow and one end to the corn crib that feeds the cow, that keeps the cow locked in. Now what's the chiddush there? Because when you untie it, you may only untie one end. You may just untie the cow and leave it tied to the crib, or vice versa. So that may end up being a permanent knot. So Gemara actually says that Rabbi Acha, Aricha, who is Rabbi Acha bar Papa, asked to Rabbi Abba, how could you say this? We have a brisa which says that you're allowed to tie one end But you're not allowed to tie both ends. If you have one end that's already tied, you're allowed to tie the other end. We're not afraid that you're going to untie the end that was tied in the first place and leave this end tied on. But to come tie both ends, you can't, because one of those knots is probably going to stay. So the Gemara answers, he was talking about not a standard rope, he was talking about a weaver's rope, and therefore it's not going to stay there long term. Okay, now the Gemara wants to know about various different devices involved in the weaver's loom. Are they muktzah on Shabbos or not? The issue is some of them are very heavy and some of them are very expensive, and they can easily break. And therefore, it could be muktzah because you wouldn't use it for something else. Now, Rashi calls it kli shemalachta le'isser. Sometimes Rashi uses that expression to refer to muktzah machmas chisar and kiss. But over here he says malachta le'isser, meaning that its main purpose is forbidden, that's weaving, and you wouldn't use it for anything else because it's too heavy or it's too expensive. So first of all, the Gemara calls them kli chivoi, that's weavers' devices, and Shmuel says that they are not muktzah. So the Gemara asks, Rabbi Yehuda asks that we see that in the weaving there are two weights. One is hung on each end of the strings to keep the strings taut. So the Gemara says that they asked Rabbi Yehuda, those weights, are they muktzah or not? And he wasn't sure. Okay, another version of this discussion, the Gemara says Rav Nachman it said in the name of Shmuel that the various implements of weaving are not forbidden on Shabbos and not muktzah, even the weights. But the poles that are set in the ground to hold up the entire loom apparatus, that is muktzah. You're not allowed to take the poles out of the ground. So Rava asked, why not? What's the problem? Are you afraid that you will make holes in the ground when you remove the poles? You'll shift the dirt a little and you'll widen the hole. It's not a problem. You're allowed to pull something out of the ground even if it makes a hole a little bit. How do I know? There's a Mishnah. The Mishnah is discussing where you plan on storing vegetables in the ground. These are already ripe vegetables. You want to store them for safekeeping in the ground so they shouldn't become spoiled. So let's say turnips. The Mishnah says you have a few problems here. First of all, it could potentially be shmita. It could be viewed as if it's planting it. It could potentially become kelayim if it's near fruit trees. And the question is, are you allowed to take them out on Shabbos? So this Mishnah says all three are not an issue. It will not take root. Therefore, it's not kelayim. It's not a problem of shmita. And you let it pull out of the ground on Shabbos. It's not a problem. So you see there that you make a hole by pulling something out of the ground. That type of hole is not a violation of the Isser of making holes on Shabbos. So the Gemara says that's different. That's in the field. In the field, we're not afraid you're going to fill in the hole to smooth it out because you don't care about a hole in the field. This is in your house or this is in your factory. Wherever your loom is. There, you can't take something out of the ground and leave a hole behind because we're concerned on Shabbos you're going to end up filling in the hole. Okay, now, similar discussion here about what we had before. Is Rabbi Yochanan asking Rabbi Yehuda bar Levoi, what's with the weaver tools, like, for example, the weights that are on the end of the strings, are they muktzah or not? And he said they are muktzah. They're too heavy to use, and they're muktzah. You can't use them for anything else. Now we get to the next Mishnah, which discusses the halacha of folding clothing. Now, there are two potential problems with folding clothing, like a talis or anything else, on Shabbos. First of all, it seems like it's being prepared for after Shabbos, because when you fold it, it is going to be nice and stiff and neat for the next time that you wear it. So the Mishnah says you're allowed to do it if you're planning on wearing it on Shabbos. Again, as a matter of fact, you're allowed to fold it up 4 or 5 times if you're planning to wear it still on Shabbos because you're preparing it for Shabbos. But you're not allowed to do it if you're not planning on wearing it until after Shabbos because what you're doing now is preparing it so that it should be neat and not wrinkled and creased for after Shabbos. That's forbidden. Now there's another issue with folding, but the Mishnah doesn't seem concerned with it, so we'll get to it when we get to the Gemara. The Gemara also on the subject of preparing for after Shabbos says you're allowed to make the bed Friday night if you're planning on sleeping in it during Shabbos still, but you can't make it if you're not going to use it until after Shabbos. Rabbi Shmuel says that you're allowed to do both of these things, folding and preparing the bed from Yom Kippur, which falls on a Friday, to Shabbos, which falls afterwards. Now the Gemara talks about bringing chalavim, the fats from karbanos. So you're allowed to bring them from Shabbos Yom Kippur for Yom Kippur to Shabbos. Meaning the fats of a carbon brought on Shabbos, can you burn them on Yom Kippur that follows? So here we have a machlekes. Rabbi Kippur says you're not allowed to do either. You're not allowed to bring from Shabbos Yom Kippur or Yom Kippur to Shabbos. But the Tanna Kama says you can bring Shabbos fats on Yom Kippur, but not vice versa. Okay. Now the Gemara. The Gemara is concerned with another issue in folding the clothing on Shabbos, and that is that it's nira kimitakin. It appears like you're fixing it. You're going to end up smoothing it out and making it nice and neat that looks like you're fixing it by getting rid of the wrinkles. So the Gemara therefore says that there's a list of conditions that have to apply in order to be allowed to fold something on Shabbos, even if you're folding it for use on Shabbos. So there's no question of preparing it for after Shabbos. You got to do it in a way where it will not seem like it's being fixed. And that is, first of all, it has to be one person folding himself. You can't have two people together. It cannot be old clothing, because that is very important to smooth out and fix. Only new clothing. It cannot be colored clothing, which are important to smooth. It has to be only white. And it can't be that you have a change and you don't need to use this. It has to be that this is the only clothing you have, and therefore you very much need to fold it up. The Gemara now adds that in the house of Rabban Gamliel, they did not fold anything, even the white clothing, because they had a change, and therefore they didn't need it. Okay, now the Gemara on the subject of changing clothing gets into covered Shabbos. And the Gemara says that, you should really change your clothing for Shabbos. You shouldn't wear weekday clothing. If you don't have a change, then you should wear them lower. You should set them on yourself so that they hang lower. Why? That's what the royalty like to do. They wear it like that because they're not afraid of the clothing dragging on the floor. They have plenty. They don't have to lift it up, and therefore they often sweep the floor with the clothing that they wore. So you should dress like that. That way you're doing something to be mechaber the Shabbos. So Safra asked, it looks like you're a Baal Gaiva. So Gemara says, no, since it's not how you dress during the week, it's not that you're a Baal Gaiva. It's clearly just being added to your gear. You're changing the way you're wearing it in order to honor Shabbos. Now the Gemara goes to the pasuk which teaches us a number of halachos about covered Shabbos. It's a pasuk in Yeshaya that says, "Im tashrik mi Shabbos raglecha, asayis chavatzacha b'yom kodeshi, karos LaShabbos oineg, likdei Hashem mechubad v'chibadetoi." Here's what we're going to focus on. Chibadetoi me'asayis derchecha. You should honor it from doing your things. Mimsay chavtzacha, taking care of your needs. V'daber davar, and speaking words. So what are each of these things? So the Gemara says, is wearing different clothing at Shabbos than you wear during the week. Like Rabbi Yochanan used to call his Shabbos clothing his mechabdusi, his honor. Means you shouldn't walk on Shabbos like you walk during the week. The Gemara will explain that. Means you shouldn't be busy checking out what you need to do after Shabbos to your property. And daber davar means you shouldn't speak on Shabbos like you speak during the week. You are, however, allowed to think about non-Shabbosic thoughts on Shabbos. That's not forbidden, but you shouldn't be speaking about money and sales and calculations. That stuff shouldn't be done on Shabbos. Okay, now the Gemara says, I understand all of this, but what do you mean you shouldn't walk on Shabbos like you walk during the week? How should your walking be different? So the Gemara says you shouldn't take big steps. You should not take long strides. You shouldn't be hurrying Shabbos. You should walk calmly and peacefully. Where do we see an example of this? The Gemara has a quote of Rav Huna Marav, or maybe it's Rav Ava, the name Rav Huna. If somebody's walking on Shabbos and he comes to a stream, he wants to go across the stream, so he's not allowed to stride across the stream unless it's close enough for him to be able to step over in one step. If he has to leap or skip or jump, meaning he can't keep both feet, he can't keep one foot on the ground the whole time, he has to go airborne, that's too far, and therefore he should not jump over it. If it's close enough, so it's not such a jump, so then he can even skip over it. Now the Gemara says, hold on a second, that can't be, because then what are you supposed to do? You can't walk all the way around the stream. That's going to be a waste of time, and it's walking too far. You're adding stress. What should you do? Walk through the water? Well, then your clothing will get wet, and you may end up squeezing it out. So since you're stuck, you are allowed to jump over it, even though it's a big step. It's only where you don't have to take such big steps that you shouldn't. Similar to that, the Gemara says, Rabbi asked Yishmael by Rabbi Yaisi, are you allowed to take big steps on Shabbos? And he said you're not allowed to take big steps even during the week. Big steps, long steps, wide strides, it takes away 1/500th of your vision. You can get that back if you look at the Kiddush Cup Friday night. That helps that to come back. Now, on that, similar to that, Rabbi also asked Rabbi Yishmael by Rabbi Yaisi, are you allowed to eat earth? Earth apparently had some restorative properties, and he said you're not allowed to eat earth not only on Shabbos, you're not allowed to eat earth. He was asking, is the problem of curative things, things which have medical properties which you're not allowed to do on Shabbos. So he said you're not allowed to do this even during the week, because it's bad for you, it's going to hurt you. There could be worms in there, and all kinds of things which could make you sick. Where do you see that? Rav Ami said somebody who eats from the dirt of Bavel, it's as if he's eaten his father's flesh. And some say it's as if he's eating shkatzim uramasim, creeping and crawling creatures. How do you know that? Because when the Torah describes the Mabel, it says vayimach es kol yikum, and Rish Lakish says, why is Bavel called Shin-Or, which means to shake out? Because all the people who died in the Mabel from vayimach es kol yikum, all those people fell down to the lowest level, which was the valley of Bavel, and therefore everybody's father's remains are in there. And Rav Yochanan says it's also called Mitzula, which means the depths, because all the people in the Mabel sunk to the bottom of the water, and that was over there by Shinar. Some say it's as if he eats bugs. Gemara asks, why would you say that? The bugs are all disintegrated by far. So the Gemara says, no, but because it is not good for you, it's not healthy, the Rabbanan made Zera as if it is eating bugs to prevent you from eating it. Hey, it's unhealthy because it was a story about somebody who ate a clump of earth. It was clay, and there was a worm in there, and it infested his insides and got to his heart, and that caused him to die. Okay, now the Gemara goes back to the discussion of Shabbos clothing, and this brings us to a discussion of Rus. Rus changed her clothing. She put on Shabbos clothing when she went to the granary to meet Boaz. So Gemara is going to analyze a number of psukim throughout Rus and discuss them, and that'll be, I got it to pretty much close to the end of the page. So the Gemara says about Rus, it says, that Nami told her to put on her dress. So the Gemara says, what do you mean put on her dress? That means put on her special dress, put on her Shabbos clothing. Now the Gemara says that there were two situations where you told somebody something and he was smarter than the person who told it, and he was able to take the instructions to a higher level, like Shlomo Melech says in Mishlei Tein Chacham V'Yachkamoid. He tells something smart to a smart man, and then he can actually add to it. What are these two things? First of all, Rus. And the second one is Shmuel. What happened by Rus? Nami told her to bathe and anoint herself and put on her fancy clothing and go down to the granary. She took the stuff with her and did that all when she got there. She didn't want to be walking the street all adorned, lest people think she is a prostitute. Now, what happened with Shmuel? Shmuel, when he was young, was lying in his bed and he heard Hashem calling him, and he didn't know what it was. So he went to Eli and said, what should I do? And Eli said, next time you hear it, you should say, Hashem, speak, I am listening. Shmuel still wasn't convinced that it was Hashem. So he went back, and instead of saying, Hashem, speak, he said, speak, I'm listening. And Hashem again called him. He said, Shmuel, Shmuel. And Shmuel said, speak, Daber ki shemei avdecha, I am listening. Didn't say Hashem. Okay. Next, we go back to the story of Rus. It says, she went and came and went and came to pick in the field. What does that mean? She went and came, and she was going back and forth, waiting for the group of cutters of grain to be upstanding people. She didn't want to be spending a good time amongst people who might be inappropriate, because she was on a high level. Okay, next it says that Boaz asked his workers, who's that girl? So Mara asked, what is Boaz doing asking about a girl? He didn't notice all the girls that were around. So Mara says no, but she did something which caught his eye, either as a very special keeping of halacha or as a special keeping of tznius. Halacha would be that she was careful only to take 2 stalks or less that fell. She didn't take more than that, which is not leket. It could be that they were allowed to take it because of tzedakah, but she only wanted to take leket, which is when 2 stalks are dropped from the hand of the cutter, not more than that. And as far as her tznius, her special modesty, when she picked something that was still growing, there was 1 stalk that was missed, or 2, she's allowed to take that, so she picked it standing up, but when something fell and she had to take it off the ground, she didn't bend over, which would be exposing herself on it necessarily. She crouched, so that was more modest, and that very special saintly behavior caught Boaz's eye. Okay, next he told Rus that you should stick with my workers, they're going to help you. So the Gemara says, first of all, what kind of business is it of people sticking together with women? Now there's a question of the Gersa here, whether it's the problem is speaking to women or sticking to the women, which means sticking close to the women. You're not supposed to do that. The Gemara says no, because Boaz had heard that she kissed Arpa, that Arpa kissed Rus, that Arpa kissed Nami and left her, and Rus still stuck with her. So he said, okay, it's obviously permitted to stick with this woman because she is on a higher level, and therefore I can tell my workers to stick with her. Okay. Next, Boaz said to her, Gishi halom, come over here. He used the word halom. So the Gemara says he had a moment of Ruach HaKodesh, and he was hinting that she would be the mother of the kingship of David HaMelech, who used the word halom when it says Vayavai HaMelech David Vayeshev L'Snei Hashem Vayemer Mi Anochi Adeini Hashem Omi Beisi Ki Havisani Ad Halom is the word Halom, and that's being hinted at to Rus. Okay, next, Baz told Rus means you should dip your bread into vinegar. So Rabbi Lazar says here you see that vinegar is good for when you're in a situation where it is too hot. Vinegar is good for you then. That's what he was giving her, vinegar. Now Rav Shmuel Bar Nachmani says, no, the point of that was teaching her that she's going to have offspring, unfortunately, which will be difficult to Klal Yisrael like vinegar, and that's referring to King Menashe, who was a disaster for Klal Yisrael. Okay, on that subject, it says that the harvesters were placed between Boaz and Rus, meaning it says Vateshu mitzad hakotzrim, she was on the side of the harvesters and Boaz was on the other side, and the rest of the harvesters were between Boaz and Rus, meaning they were separated, they were split by them. So the Gemara says this is again symbolism to tell her that her kingship would eventually be split. The kingship that descended from Shlomo was split off into Malchus Yehuda and Malchus Yisrael. Next we have Yitzbat lo Kali, he fed her roasted grain, and it says Vatocha Vatisba Vatosar, she ate and she became satiated and she left over. That's three words describing fullness and satiation. The Gemara understands it as referring to future riches. The Gemara has three explanations as to what it is referring to. One is that it's referring to David, Shlomo, and Chizkiah, all who had riches. Another one is that it's referring to David and Shlomo is one, Chizkiah is another, and the last one is referring to Rebbe. Like it says, Rebbe's horsekeeper was even wealthier than King Shavar. And then there's a Mishnah that actually says that it's referring to Olam Hazeh, Olam Haba, and Yemoseh Mashiach, that she was wealthy in all those three areas. Okay, now the Gemara moves to something similar, unrelated at all, but it is similar in the sense that it has the same three opinions that we had before about the vinegar. So the Gemara says that the pasuk describing the destruction of the soldiers of Sancherib, the king of Ashur, it says, V'tachas kvodo yekad yikoid ki koid eish, that underneath their honor, or tachas, their honor, they became burned up. So what does this mean? So the Gemara has three opinions. The first two say that their bodies burnt, but their clothing remained intact, but the question is how you translate the psukim. Rav Yochanan says, kvodo refers to their clothing, and tachas means under. So it's under their clothing, they became burned up. It fits with Rav Yochanan's opinion, who called his clothing, his Shabbos clothing, mechabadusi, like we said earlier. Now Rav Elazar said, no, tachas means instead of, and kavodi means the body, meaning instead of the body, they had ash instead because the body's burned up. Shmuel understands a mix of the two. Shmuel says that kavodi means the body, but tachas means under. So under the body, what's under the body? It's referring to their soul. Their soul burnt and the bodies remained intact, just like happened to the sons of Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, when they brought an improper carbon into the Beis Hamikdash. The bodies were, their soul burnt out of them and their bodies remained intact.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.